Hi, I'm Kate. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to have a little chat about the strange case of Sam and Marilyn Sheppard. This is a fairly famous case, and if you've heard of it, there's a good chance that it's because it was the supposed inspiration for the Fugitive TV show as well as the movie of the same name starring Harrison Ford, although this has been disputed by the creators of both. But there are other reasons this case should be remembered. It produced a landmark U.S. Supreme Court ruling regarding protections from excessive and adverse media coverage, something that is definitely common today, and helped launch the career of F. Lee Bailey, the attorney who would go on to be involved with other huge profile cases such as Patty Hearst, the Boston Strangler, and O.J. Simpson. Also, the case is simply bizarre. Still, it's undeniable that one of the main reasons this case is remembered is its connection, however tenuous, to the fugitive. Sam Sheppard was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, and seems to have been a bit of a golden child growing up. He really excelled in school, even becoming class president for 3 years. He also was really involved in sports and was good enough to be offered scholarships from several Ohio universities, although he eventually attended Hanover College in Indiana to study medicine like his father and brothers had before him. Junior high school is also where he met his future wife, Marilyn. He continued his studies and eventually ended up completing his internship and residency in Los Angeles before returning to Ohio with his wife, where he joined his father's medical practice at Bayview Hospital in Bay Village, Ohio, as a neurosurgeon. And in a lot of ways, the family seemed sort of picture perfect, but everything changed on the evening of July 3rd, 1954. That night, the Sheppards had some of their neighbors, Dan and Nancy Ahern, and their 2 children over to their home for dinner. At some point, Don Ahern took his children back home before returning to the Sheppards, and Marilyn tucked her and Sam's son, Chip, into bed. The adults then settled in to watch the movie Strange Holiday on TV. At one point, Sam and Marilyn were sitting together and watching the movie, but eventually Sam separated from the group and went to go lay down on the day bed in the living room and eventually fell asleep. Around midnight, Marilyn showed the neighbors out, which was the last time that she was seen alive. In the early morning hours of the 4th of July, likely sometime between 3 and 4:45 a.m., someone murdered Marilyn Sheppard in her bed by bludgeoning her with an unknown object. And that's all we really know for sure. Aside from those bare-bones facts, the rest of this case is shrouded in mystery and is hotly debated to the present date. According to Sam Sheppard, he awoke at some point in the night after hearing Marilyn screaming from the upper level of the house. He rushed up and saw what he described as a, quote, bushy-haired, white biped form whom he got into a struggle with. Although Sam said he was grappling this person from the front, he thought that he was somehow hit from behind and was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, he went to go check on Marilyn and determined she didn't have a pulse. And then he went and quickly checked on their son and says he just sort of looked in but somehow sensed he was fine. It's kind of an odd description of how he checked on his son. But then, after hearing a noise, he went back downstairs where he says he saw the person again that he had seen before and chased them from the house and down to the nearby shore of Lake Erie where the 2 fought, and Sheppard was once again knocked unconscious. Sam later said of the attack on the beach, quote, "I felt myself twisting or choking, and this terminated my consciousness," end quote. He had a very certain way of saying things. During all this, and apparently up until the police eventually arrived, the Sheppard's son, Chip, was still asleep in his bedroom, which was next door to the room where the attack took place. Also, apparently the Sheppard's dog never barked or anything, which is a little strange. Sam eventually woke up on the beach, and after returning to the house and wandering around for a few minutes, apparently wondering what to do, at 5:40 a.m., he phoned his friend, Spencer Hook, who was also the mayor of Bay Village, and begged for him to come over, saying, quote, "I think they have killed Marilyn," end quote. Understandably, Hook and his wife Esther rushed over and found Sheppard in disarray. He was disoriented, which, if he had received 2 blows to the back of the head and neck area, serious enough to knock him out, it's not surprising. He apparently was laying down on the ground, was having like convulsions in his neck. He seemed to be in pretty bad shape. He was shirtless and his pants were damp and had a blood stain on one knee. Sam said that when he had regained consciousness after the second attack on the beach, he was missing his shirt and his watch. He blamed his sort of haziness on the details of what had happened, as well as the details of the attacker's appearance on being hit on the head, which is not really a bad excuse, but if you believe he's guilty, it's just that, an excuse. A police officer, Fred Drinkin, arrived at the Sheppard home at 6. He went upstairs to check on Marilyn and found her lying in her bed face up with her head towards the door. Her pajama top had been pulled up and her pajama bottoms had been removed from one leg. Her face and head were badly injured with over 20 cuts to her face and scalp, and blood was everywhere, from the bedding beneath her to the walls and closet doors around the bed. An autopsy would later determine that she had died around 4:30 a.m. and had been 4 months pregnant. Drinkin also found apparent evidence of a robbery or perhaps a staged robbery in the hallway. Sam's medical bag had been knocked over and rifled through, and items were scattered on the floor. Sam's desk drawers were all opened, but nothing appeared to actually be missing. There also didn't seem to be any forced entry into the house, although it's possible that Marilyn hadn't actually locked any doors before she went up to bed, but we really don't know. Outside, a small bag was found which contained Sam's watch, as well as a couple other small items, and the watch was waterlogged and had blood on it. The coroner, Sam Gerber, got to the house at about 8 a.m., and after being briefed on the initial findings by Drinkin, seemed to immediately suspect that Sam was responsible for his wife's murder, and conducted his investigation with that preconception in mind. While there are definitely odd things about the crime scene and Sheppard's version of events, Gerber may have been focused too much on Sheppard and therefore didn't collect as many fingerprint and other forensic evidence as he should have, and something could have easily been overlooked. Sam himself was taken to the hospital due to his injuries to his head and neck and was questioned by police that afternoon and the next day. He repeatedly tells his story about the bushy-haired intruder and claims that he was innocent of any involvement in Marilyn's death. But after speaking with Sam for about 10 minutes and collecting and inspecting the clothes he'd been wearing, Gerber seemed convinced. He apparently told the detective that day, quote, "It's obvious that the doctor did it." At some point during the initial investigation of the house, a neighbor and friend of the Sheppards, NFL quarterback Otto Graham, stopped by the house to see what was going on and, for some inexplicable reason, was allowed into the Sheppards' bedroom by police. I don't think Graham was ever considered a potential suspect, but this could have obviously tainted the crime scene. Graham told the Saturday Evening Post of the bedroom, quote, "It looks like someone stood in the middle of the room with a great big can of red paint and a brush and flicked it all around," end quote. And, quote, "Whoever did it, they had to be out of their mind," end quote. The case immediately blew up in the press, and initially Sam was treated sympathetically. It was believed that maybe a drug addict had broken into the house, expecting that a doctor would have something good to steal. As police pressure on Sam ramped up and rumors flew, however, the press turned hostile to Sam and occasionally the police. Articles simultaneously accused Sam of not cooperating enough with the police and the police of not working hard enough or quickly enough. Doubling down on their suspicions of Sam, police struggled to find a good motive for the murder. There was some initial speculation that Sam was sterile due to exposure to X-rays and that Marilyn had become pregnant due to an affair, but there was no evidence of that, although Sam said a possible motive lay with the men who were interested in Marilyn but were rejected by her. Then a friend of Marilyn had come forward with the story that Sam had been having an affair with a laboratory technician named Sue Hayes, as well as potentially other women. Sam claimed that he and Sue were just friends who worked together, but Sue eventually did admit to having an affair with him that was pretty involved. Although Sam continued denying an intimate relationship with her, any remaining sympathy the public and press had for Sam was gone. It also came out that Marilyn had allegedly likened her husband to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Amid ever-increasing pressure, police eventually arrested Sam on the 30th of July at his parents' home. Sam's defense motioned to have the trial moved outside of Cleveland and delayed because of the intense publicity surrounding the case, but the judge denied it. This would be important later. Columnist and TV personality Dorothy Kilgallen said years later, after the judge's death, that she was told by the judge that the case was, quote, open and shut, and that Sheppard was, quote, guilty as hell. The names and photos of the jury members were printed in newspapers, which doesn't seem like the best idea. Also, all but one of the jurors admitted to already being familiar with both facts and rumors about the case, which could have affected their ability to be impartial. The prosecution argued that Sam had been involved in multiple affairs, which he and Marilyn argued about often, and suggested that Sam had wanted a divorce, but that Marilyn had refused, or that she wanted a divorce, but he didn't like the way that would look publicly, and this is why he killed her. Testimony also indicated that there was no evidence of the struggle with an intruder Sam had described in the Sheppard house, and that the shape of a bloodstain on a pillow pointed to a surgical instrument being used in the attack on Marilyn. The defense argued that Sam and Marilyn were happy and excited to be expecting a second child. Sam himself testified that the topic of divorce had never even come up between them. Also, the injuries Sam got that night would have been very difficult, if not impossible, to inflict on himself. A nurse who took care of Sam when he was in the hospital said that his feet had been all pruny, like they would be if he had been in water for a long time, indicating that his story about lying unconscious on the beach with the surf washing over him was possible. Toward the end of the trial, Sam took the stand for 3 days. The defense team hoped that it would help the jury empathize with him, but the odd and technical way that he spoke didn't do him any favors. Instead of saying that he saw something, he would say he visualized it. Instead of saying something knocked him out, he would say it terminated his consciousness. It was just weird. He also finally admitted to having an affair with Sue Hayes, although he said he never planned on leaving Marilyn for her. The trial lasted about a month, and the jury deliberated for 4 days before returning with a verdict of guilty of the charge of second-degree murder. Sheppard was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. Less than a month after the trial ended, Sam's mother, Ethel Sheppard, took her own life, and only 11 days after that, his father, Richard Sheppard, died of cancer. It obviously wasn't a great time for the family. A criminalist from California came in and did a thorough investigation of the crime scene, and his resulting report concluded that whoever the murderer was, they were left-handed. Sam was right-handed, and had used a flashlight as a weapon. He said they also probably hated the Sheppards, which, yeah. There was also evidence of blood that didn't belong to either of the Sheppards. Based on this report, Sam's attorney filed a motion for a new trial, but the court denied it. Shortly afterwards, a swimmer who lived near the Sheppard home found a dented flashlight in the waters near the shore of Lake Erie. 4 years later, in 1959, Richard Eberling, a man who had washed windows at the Sheppard home and who had been interviewed during the initial investigation, was arrested for larceny, and a search of his home turned up a lot of stolen items, including a ring which had been owned by Marilyn. On a wild hunch, police asked Eberling why his blood had been in the Sheppard home after the murder. They hadn't actually found his blood, or if they had, they didn't know it was his. But Eberling told them that he had cut himself while working in the home a couple days before the murder had happened, and may have dripped blood throughout the house. A polygraph examination given to him about his possible involvement was inconclusive. Sam's original attorney died in 1961, and so he eventually went on to find a new one named F. Lee Bailey, who argued that all of the publicity before and during Sam's trial had been prejudicial and therefore violated his right to due process. Sam also started developing a new love interest at this time, corresponding with a German woman, but even though they kept corresponding, it turned up that she had a sister, an older sister, who was married to Joseph Goebbels. What the heck? In 1963, the Fugitive TV show began to air. It revolved around a doctor who had been wrongly convicted of killing his pregnant wife. Obviously, that basic description is pretty close to the Sheppard case, although the creator of the show said it wasn't based on the real case. Still, most people assumed it was. The next year, in 1964, Sheppard's conviction was overturned thanks to F. Lee Bailey's petition, with the judge saying the original trial 10 years ago had been, quote, a mockery of justice, end quote. Sam then married the German woman he'd been seeing, but shortly afterwards, an appeal court reinstated his conviction, but allowed him to remain free on bail until his own appeal could go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And in 1966, the Supreme Court agreed with the original decision, overturning Sheppard's conviction, and only 2 days later, prosecutors said they were going forward with another trial. Because of the, quote, carnival atmosphere of the first trial, which had been criticized by the higher courts, the prosecution did dial things back a little bit, and F. Lee Bailey handled the case expertly, creating reasonable doubt when it came to the prosecution's experts and evidence, especially when it came to the blood spatter evidence. Perhaps just as important was the fact that Sam didn't testify this time, although it may have potentially looked bad that he didn't want to go up and tell his side of the story in front of the jury. It was clear from the first trial that his strange way of speaking did not go over well with the jury. Sort of instead of that, Bailey decided to put forth an alternative suspect. Not Richard Eberling, although he may have seemed like an obvious choice, but instead the wife of Spencer Hook, the first person Sam had called the morning of July 4th. Bailey insinuated that Marilyn and Spencer could have been having an affair, and that Spencer's wife, Esther, had killed Marilyn out of anger and jealousy, possibly even with the assistance of her husband. Even though it wasn't that cold that morning, she had supposedly lit a fire, which could have been used to burn bloody clothing or other evidence. And Bailey also argued that if Sam had been Marilyn's attacker, her injuries would have been more extreme. I mean, they were extreme, but like the force used indicated that they had been inflicted by someone who wasn't as strong as Sam had been. And whether or not F. Lee Bailey actually considered Esther a real possible suspect, it didn't really matter. He was just trying to create enough reasonable doubt in the jury to get them on his side, and it worked. On November 16, 1966, the jury voted to acquit. But if Sam was innocent, the damage was already done. He tried to move on with his life and go back to being a doctor, but he had developed a bad drinking problem at that point, and not practicing for over 10 years didn't help. He badly botched a couple of surgeries and ended up killing both patients. He also started taking barbiturates and eventually filed for divorce from his second wife amid more accusations of infidelity. By 1969, he had started working as a professional wrestler using the name Killer Sheppard, married for the third time, and less than a year later, he died from liver disease at age 46. The mystery didn't end there, however. If Sam was innocent, who did kill Marilyn? Focus eventually zeroed in on Richard Eberling, who was convicted of first-degree murder in 1989, relating to an insurance scheme involving an elderly woman he had befriended. And when questioned about the Sheppard case, Eberling hinted that he was involved and that he knew more about the case than he was willing to say, but he died in prison in 1998 without ever actually officially confessing. The Sheppard's son, Chip, eventually filed a civil suit against the county on behalf of Sam for wrongful imprisonment. In the civil trial, Sheppard's side argued that Eberling was the actual killer, while the county side said the original trial verdict had been accurate and that Sam was guilty. Surprisingly, in my opinion, the jury ended up siding with the county, and the majority of jurors said they thought Sam was responsible for Marilyn's murder. There are definitely things that don't really make sense about the case, both if you're arguing that Sam is guilty or innocent. If Sam was innocent, why didn't the Sheppard's dog bark if there had been one or possibly more intruders? If Marilyn had screamed multiple times loud enough to wake Sam downstairs, why didn't their son wake up in the next room? What happened to Sam's shirt after he was knocked unconscious on the beach? Why did little inconsistencies keep occurring in Sam's version of events? At different points, for instance, he claimed to have been hit the first time on the stairs, in the hallway, and in the bedroom. He was also very vague on some points, while being very specific and detailed on others. If Sam was guilty, how did he get injured so badly? It's been suggested that Marilyn could have hit him in self-defense, but again, if she'd been able to fight back as much as she would have apparently had to do in order to hurt him the way that she had, why didn't the struggle wake up the son in the next room? She probably would have yelled in that situation. Also, Sam was a very smart guy, so if he made a plan to kill his wife, why would he come up with such a strange story to cover it up? And if he'd done it in the heat of the moment, why would he stage Marilyn so that her body was exposed? He also had no history of violent behavior. Not that that necessarily means anything, but acting out so viciously without planning it seems unusual. A couple of trophies were also seemingly damaged in the supposed burglary. Why would Sam do that? It's sort of unclear. They could have been damaged earlier. There's just a lot of weird things in this case, but if they were damaged earlier, why would they have just been left lying around? Sam didn't mention anything about them being damaged earlier, but he could have been using that, I guess, if he was guilty, as proof of break-in. But again, why would he damage those? Considering all the blood at the crime scene, why would Sam have only one spot of blood on the knee of his pants and nowhere else? Also, although it wasn't definitively proven, I don't think, to be his missing shirt, a similar shirt was found near the house and had no bloodstains on it. If the expert who said the killer was left-handed was correct, is it likely that Sam, who was right-handed, would have used his left hand? Finally, DNA evidence, which was tested during the civil trial, showed that there was blood not belonging to either Sam or Marilyn at the scene, although, again, the accuracy of this old evidence, not collected with DNA testing in mind, has been questioned. And what about Richard Eberling? Some people say he's definitely responsible, and others say there's no way he is. He did know the family, although he claims to have known Marilyn much more than Sam. He said he hardly ever saw Sam, but he confessed to being attracted to Marilyn in kind of a creepy way. The ring belonging to Marilyn was found in his possession, but it was apparently stolen years later from a different Sheppard family member's house. But if he was responsible for the murder, maybe he recognized the ring and wanted to have it as a trophy. But if that's the case, why didn't he take anything while he was there murdering her? He was aware of an obscure entrance to the home in the basement, which, if he was the murderer, could explain why there was no sign of forced entry to the home that night. He also said the Sheppard's dog knew him well enough to not bark when he was around. The polygraph test he took initially concluded there was no deception in his response to being asked about the killing of Marilyn, which is why F. Lee Bailey didn't use Eberling as an alternative suspect, but later experts said it was inconclusive or showed deception. Also, polygraphs are not really very accurate. There's a reason they can't be used as evidence in a trial, and the test could be completely meaningless. Eberling was also not someone you would necessarily describe as bushy-haired, and in fact he was sort of balding already at the time apparently, but he was known to have worn toupees. It does seem like if he was wearing a toupee, though, it could have easily come off during the two fights that he'd had with Sam. Unlike Sam, we do know that Eberling had a violent streak, particularly towards women, killing at least one, for which he was convicted, and is suspected of killing at least one other woman and assaulting at least one other. It seems like he really just enjoyed dangling the possibility that he was responsible for Marilyn's death. He just liked the feeling of getting attention for that. He even allegedly confessed to a couple people before he died, although he said later that he never said that to at least one of them. And he never did so officially, and could have just been messing with people, let's face it. He gave accounts of the murder, like multiple different accounts, and some of them were clearly false, like completely clearly just completely made up, but that just makes it really hard to believe anything he had to say. So, while Sam and Eberling seem like the most likely suspects, it's possible someone else we don't even know about was responsible. Maybe more than one if Sam was correct in saying that he was hit from behind while struggling with the intruder in front. And again, we probably won't ever know for sure. So someday, maybe I'll do a case where it's pretty open and shut. We know exactly what happened. Maybe next week. I don't know. We'll see. But that's all I have for you guys today. Thanks for having a chat with me, and like and subscribe and all that stuff. And I will see you guys next time. Bye.